Thanks for tuning in. Hello everyone, welcome to episode 5 of my N-Gage layout build. I would like to start this episode by just very quickly thanking everyone who's been watching the videos, commenting and subscribing. I've been very pleasantly surprised with all the feedback I've had so far, so cheers for that. In this episode, we are going to transform our rather barren looking layout into something that hopefully resembles real life by using ground cover, static grass and other things. I hope you guys are fans of time lapses because this episode is full of them. With that said, let's get started. So this is how we left the railway last episode. The general shape of the land is there, but everything is either white, pink or brown, which by my calculations puts us at about 75% of the way towards being Neapolitan ice cream. To remedy this, we're going to begin working towards adding colour and texture to the landform to simulate dirt, grass and other things. Stage 1 of this process is going to be getting some paint down onto all of the different materials we have to unify them and to hide the unnatural colours. I'm starting off with some Woodland Scenics raw umber on the plaster and the pink area of the foam where we've sanded away the poster paint towards the front right of the layout. It's a pretty thin paint, so I'm slapping it down quite liberally with a cheap brush, just being careful to avoid any drips or runs, and in particular making sure no paint gets onto the plywood sides. We're also not painting the rocks as they're going to be grey, so we'll do that separately. I'm not exactly sure what the deal is with this paint. It's super thin, and I think it might be supposed to be a sort of wash where you use it specifically on plaster rocks, and the thin paint naturally goes into the cracks to create colour variation. In any case, in terms of its ability to be used for covering the ground, it isn't particularly good, and I certainly wouldn't use it for this purpose again, as even after 2 coats it's a little patchy. Moving on to the rocks, I decided to use standard acrylic paint for these. I picked a neutral grey colour for the base coat, which I mixed together from some Vallejo and Citadel colours. As you can see, the coverage on this type of paint is much better, and after this was dry I came in with a brown Citadel wash called Agrax Earthshade to get a little depth to the colour. A little note on Citadel colours: they have a rather zealous legal team, so they've given all their colours weird names so that they can copyright them, so apologise for the funky call-outs on these. Once this was done, I know the rock started to look a little bit dark, but this is just the base coat, and we're going to dry brush on lighter colours as we go to lighten them up and add a little bit of colour variation, so don't you worry. Now we are working on the texture around the base of the rocky outcrops and also where the pond is going to be. I'm going to start by adding some small stones, which I got from my local hobby shop to represent large rocks. PVA is spread across the layout. The rocks don't actually adhere to it particularly well, but it holds them in place at least temporarily while we do the rest of the work. Once they're on, I reapply the glue and now add some fine sand and allow it to partially cover the stones. Not only does this blend the stones in a more natural way, but once the sand is glued down, it also anchors the stone to the baseboard as well. Once this is all done, to glue it down, I follow a similar process to how I ballasted the rails, and first soak everything in IPA and then follow that up with a generous amount of PVA applied with an eyedropper. Once the sand has dried, it's painted with a neutral grey colour similar to that of the rocks. I don't have a good video of it, but I also went through and picked out individual small stones with different shades of brown to try and add a little bit of colour variation. Once that was done, I came back in with the Agrax Earthshade wash to add a bit of depth and to bring out the texture. Unfortunately, my camera died here without me realising, but at this stage I also dry brushed the rocks with a range of colours, working up from a medium grey to a much lighter grey. In fact, it was almost white. This gives a nice range of colour and makes the rocks look much more interesting. As I said, I lost the footage, but I have some more at the end which shows the same process, so hang on for that and you'll see how that's done. We're going to take a little break from the painting to start looking at the sides of the baseboard. I've applied a couple of coats of varnish, which is why you can see the nice rich colour here, and now I'm just winding the brass inserts back in for about the bazillionth time. At least it's fun to do, so I don't mind that I've had to repeat it so often. In this shot you can also see the hole where the electrical connector bezel mounts. That's towards the top of the shot there. So here we can see the electrical connector mounted into the baseboard. We've got the 18-volt input for the points on the left hand side, the 10-pin connector in the center, and then the track power input on the right. You can see I've made sure to use different size connectors for the switches and the track input because we don't want to be accidentally putting our thing in the wrong hole. So with that said, looking at the layout from a bit of a distance, I think it's all looking pretty good. The brown colour on the ground is a little bit patchy, but I don't think it's going to be a huge issue because we're going to add some ground cover which should cover most of that anyway. If we take a closer look at the rocks, you can see what I talked about previously with the dry brushing stages. There's a nice amount of colour variation there, and the lighter colours of the dry brush have really brought out the texture of the hydrocal rocks. One thing that I have learned while working on the rocks and other parts of the layout is just how important it is to layer your colours up. We can use base colours, washes, dry brushing and other techniques to vary the tone significantly, and I think it makes everything look a lot more interesting. So we've got the basic paint layer down and the layout is starting to look a little bit more uniform. The next thing is to look at the areas that will represent dirt. And to simulate that dirt, we're going to use dirt. I went and collected some from the garden and then sieved it into a small Tupperware box to get rid of all the twigs and stones and other things like that. And now that it's ready to put down, let's have a look at getting it glued onto the layout. I start by brushing on some PVA, then applying the dirt through a small sieve. This gives a pretty good amount of control over where all the dirt ends up. And from there I just work my way around the layout, doing small areas at a time. I bought this sieve specifically off Amazon rather than using the one from the kitchen because that wouldn't make me a particularly popular person in the household. One thing to note, once the dirt was actually down on the layout, the colour looked a little bit light. It's not the end of the world because it's all going to get covered up anyway, but that's just one thing to note. I followed a similar process for the area around the loading dock. To create this texture, I mixed the dirt with some grey tiling grout that I got from B&Q, and this gave me a nice grey colour which still had some texture and represents a kind of unkept gravelly yard. So the layout is really starting to come together. We've got pretty much all of the ground covered and I'm happy with how it's looking, even if the dirt is a little bit too light of a colour. One benefit of adding the dirt has been all the fine dust that is kind of within the dirt has coloured the ballast slightly and added a little bit of variation to its colour, which I think helps it blend in and makes it look a little bit more natural. The next step is to get the small depot building glued down. I've been careful not to get any ballast or ground cover underneath the area in which it's going to be planted, and I'm simply using a little bit of PVA under its base to keep it down. Once it's there, I'm going to check that the little wooden sort of platform that I've added to its side doesn't obstruct the track, so I'm using a engine and a wagon as well, just to make sure that they can run freely beside it and they're not going to get knocked off the track by that platform. With the building glued down, we can now look at neatening up the ballast and ground cover around it to blend it into the layout. I place ballast, dirt and the gravel simulate all around the depot, and this helps to hide the fact that the building sits up on a piece of card. So I make sure the texture covers at least this, because obviously we don't want to be able to see the side of it when everything's down. And then I follow the tried and tested method of using IPA and then PVA to adhere all of that ground cover to the baseboard. Now that the depot has been planted and we've completed the ballast, I'm going to do a little bit of weathering on the ballast. If you look at track in the real world, the area between the rails is normally darker because of grease and grime that comes off the wagons and the locomotives. I don't have an airbrush, so I'm going to simulate this with pigment powders. I'm using black and brown in between the rails to achieve the effect I like, and in particular I'm focusing on areas where wagons and locomotives may sit for a time, so the area in front of the depot itself will get the most attention. Personally, I think this adds a whole new dimension to the track and makes it look much more authentic. Applying different amounts of weathering to certain areas also adds a bit of a story to the layout and shows how it may be being operated. Not having an airbrush can be a pain sometimes for a variety of reasons. In particular, whilst weathering wheeled wagons without working airbrush equipment can be tricky, I find a combination of washes and pigment powders to be a good substitute. So now that the whole layout has some kind of ground cover down on it, it's time to start thinking about the grass. This is another one of those things like ballast where it's really just down to personal choice as to what you think looks best. Personally, I've never liked the look of flock, so I'm going to be using exclusively static grass to simulate the grass. And for that, I'm going to be using one of these rather humorously shaped tools. Despite what it looks like, it's actually a static grass applicator. This is a Grassmaster 3 from Nock. Basically, you fill the hopper up with your static grass, turn the machine on, it's just powered by a little D battery, and that gives the grass a charge, which means when it lands into the glue, it will actually stand up. I think it looks a lot more natural rather than just using like a puffer bottle or something like that, because the grass just ends up randomly placed rather than standing up naturally. My one piece of advice would be, wherever you leave this, leave it in its box, so if someone stumbles upon it, they don't jump to conclusions as to what you're using it for. With that said, let's look at getting the static grass down. For my layout, I'm using grass ranging between 1 and 4 millimeters, and in a range of colors from light green to dark green and even a little bit of brown as well. To begin the static grass process, I'm going to spread some glue down. The stuff I'm using here is called Static Tack and it's by Woodland Scenics. No idea if it's actually any different from PVA, it could just be a rip-off, but as my layout's so small, I thought I might as well get this stuff because I'm not going to use that much of it. I'm working in small areas at a time, and once I've got a nice little area fully covered, I'm going to come in with the static grass applicator. I filled it up with mostly 1mm grass, but a little bit of 2 and 4mm in there as well to give a bit of variation. And turning the static applicator on, I'm holding the crocodile clip close to where the grass is going to be and just giving it a gentle shake, which helps the static grass come out and it sticks up nicely in the glue. And I continue working my way around the layout, working in sections still, and just shaking the grass out of the applicator and letting it build up until it's nice and thick. because I want to get decent coverage with this first layer. And then once it's been left to dry overnight, you can come in with a vacuum cleaner with a stocking over the end and hoover up all the excess, put it back into a pot so that you can use it later. This is another one of those satisfying jobs where you take the huge mess that you've made and hoover away the excess, and you end up with something that looks really neat and gives a very convincing effect. Once the first layer was down, I repeated this whole process, but working in small patches across the layout. I'd apply glue to lots of small areas and then come back in with the applicator with a different colour and also longer fibres, and create nice little patches so that we've got some variation and we break up the green carpet look somewhat. So that gets us to this stage. The grass that's gone down looks really good, it's standing up nicely and we've got really thick coverage, but it looks a little bit too neat and tidy, despite the different patches, length and colour variation we have. We're going to come in at a later episode and use some foam products from Woodland Scenics to simulate small bushes and other kinds of foliage, which will help to break up the green carpet look. It was at this point that I changed my mind about the pond area. Originally I was going to leave the bottom of it flat and paint it in quite dark colours to simulate the pond getting very deep. But I've actually decided to cover the whole thing in sand and rocks and instead leave the pond looking quite shallow. I just think it's going to end up looking more realistic this way and blend in better with the rest of the scenery. So I followed the same process as before, placing the sand, soaking it with IPA, and then giving it a good amount of coverage with PVA to secure it all down to the baseboard. So having to redo things is a little bit frustrating. Obviously if I'd just done it all first time I would have saved myself having to come back and do it again, but I'm always open to changing my mind if I think the layout's going to end up looking a bit better. One thing it does do is give me an opportunity to show you the process that I've used for dry brushing the rocks, because I lost the footage from when I did it on the large hydrocal rocks. I've already gone ahead and painted this sand in a neutral grey acrylic colour and then used the Citadel Agrax Earth Shade wash on it to gain some contrast. Once that's dry, we can begin working back up through the colours to stop everything looking so dark and also add in some variation. There's no hard and fast rules here, just keep going until you're happy with the result. Make sure you take almost all of the paint off of the paintbrush when you're dry brushing, and then use very light strokes to get the effect you want. It's a lot easier to keep working in that frame of mind rather than adding too much paint and ruining everything you've done before. The effect is pretty subtle, so I'm showing a before and after image here so you can see the difference. The large rocks around the pond had already been done, but you can see the smaller rocks and even the sand texture looking a lot more interesting once we've done the dry brush work. So that's where we're going to leave it for this episode. The layout is looking an awful lot better with the static grass and everything painted up, and we're going to continue the scene of work next time and start looking at adding some more details and the dreaded resin pour. Let me tell you, I've already started trying to do it and it's gone horribly wrong, so you've got that to look forward to for next time. Catch you guys later. See ya.